a grand international summit hall, brimming with world leaders, diplomats, and global media. Cameras rolled, lights blazed, and the atmosphere was charged with tension, like the crackling of air before a storm. At the center of it all stood a young African leader, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, his military uniform pressed to perfection, his eyes steady and unwavering. Yet something was about to unfold that would test every fiber of his resolve. Across from him sat a seasoned Western politician, wearing the smirk of someone convinced the game was already won. The audience looked on, some with curiosity, others with prejudice barely hidden beneath polite expressions. In that instant, the world held its breath. What would he do when faced with a public humiliation crafted to shatter his spirit and belittle his nation? Stay with me, because this story will leave you speechless and reveal exactly why Ibrahim Traoré has become one of Africa's most respected voices. The World Economic Forum's annual summit in Geneva was in full motion. Marble floors glistened beneath crystal chandeliers as delegates from nearly every nation on Earth gathered for what was officially billed as a dialogue on global economic cooperation. But anyone seasoned in politics knew the truth. These gatherings were theaters of power, stages where the mighty flexed their dominance, while smaller nations were expected to sit quietly at the margins. That morning, Ibrahim Traoré had arrived with a modest delegation. At only 35 years old, he was among the youngest heads of state in attendance, and certainly among the newest. Barely 2 years had passed since he seized leadership of Burkina Faso through a military coup, pledging to his people an end to corruption, foreign exploitation, and the grinding poverty that had defined their lives for generations. As he strode through the halls, Traoré felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. Some gazes carried curiosity. Who was this young soldier daring to defy the established order? Others dripped with disdain. To many in this room, he embodied their greatest fear, an African leader unwilling to bow, unwilling to accept the rules of a system that enriched their nations, while Africa remained shackled in poverty. The morning sessions proceeded without incident. Traoré listened more than he spoke, observing dynamics, learning the unspoken hierarchies that govern these global spectacles. But everything shifted in the afternoon during a panel ominously titled Democracy and Governance in Developing Nations. The moderator, a celebrated European journalist renowned for her sharp tongue and even sharper barbs, introduced the panelists with varying tones of warmth. Yet when she reached Traoré, her voice dipped with calculated weight. And joining us, from Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré, who came to power through unconventional means. The phrase hung in the air, less an introduction than a challenge. Traoré remained composed, though those who knew him could see the subtle tightening at the corners of his eyes. He had faced bullets on the battlefield, confronted corrupt officials ensconced in palaces of stolen wealth, and stared down foreign mining executives who had plundered his country as if it were their private treasury. But this was different. This was not a gunfight. This was a public attempt to humiliate, meant not just for him, but for everything he represented. As the discussion unfolded, it became glaringly clear. This would not be a fair debate. Every question tossed his way was laden with assumptions, dripping with condescension. Captain Traoré, the moderator began, stressing his military rank while deliberately ignoring his presidential title. Your government has been criticized for its human rights record. How do you justify leading a nation when you came to power through force rather than the ballot box? The audience leaned forward, breath held. Camera operators adjusted their angles, hungry for the shot that would capture his downfall. This was the moment they anticipated, the humiliation of a young African president, the restoration of the status quo through words wielded like weapons. Traoré sat still, hands folded calmly before him. Delegates from France, the United Kingdom, and the United States watched closely. African leaders in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, haunted by memories of their own moments of being diminished on similar stages. Silence stretched like a taut wire. The moderator's smirk deepened with each passing second. She had done this before, backed African leaders into corners until they either lashed out in anger, confirming stereotypes of instability, or stumbled defensively, appearing weak and unfit for the global stage. But Ibrahim Traoré was neither flustered nor retreating. His eyes scanned the hall, absorbing the faces, sensing the energy, dissecting the intent. This was not about democracy, governance, or human rights. This was about power. This was about reasserting dominance, about putting an African leader who dared to resist Western interests back in his place. Cameras captured every flicker of expression, every pause. Social media exploded in real time, hashtags trending as millions tuned in, expecting his downfall. In the front row, a French diplomat leaned toward a colleague, whispering with a smirk. Farther back, mining executives whose profits had been disrupted by Traoré's reforms watched with undisguised satisfaction. The moderator cleared her throat, pressing the advantage. "Captain Traoré," she repeated, her voice sharp with condescension, "we're waiting for your response to these very serious questions about your legitimacy as a leader." The word legitimacy cracked across the chamber like a whip. This was the breaking point, the carefully crafted insult meant to strip away his authority and reduce him to nothing but a soldier turned strongman. In that instant, the weight of history pressed on his shoulders. He could feel the collective breath of the room, the anticipation of his humiliation. The expectation that he would stumble into apology or outburst, that he would confirm the script already written for him. But this was larger than him. Every African leader ever spoken down to on the world stage was present in that chair with him. Every child in Burkina Faso who had gone to bed hungry while billions in gold and uranium were carted away was present in his silence. Every young African watching online needed to see what dignity looked like when challenged. The moderator's eyes gleamed with triumph. She had perfected this maneuver. Corner them with loaded questions, undermine them with condescension, and watch them collapse under pressure. It had worked countless times before. Why should this soldier from a small African nation be any different? "I'll ask again, Captain," she pressed, her tone soaked with centuries of superiority. "How do you justify your position when you lack the democratic mandate that we in the international community consider essential for legitimate governance?" The phrase "we in the international community" landed like a blade. It was the same rhetoric used for centuries to justify interventions, sanctions, and exploitation. The same words that painted sovereign nations as unruly children, needing guidance from their so-called betters. The reactions told the story. Western diplomats leaned forward, eager for his stumble. Some African delegates lowered their gaze, unwilling to watch another brother diminished. Others stared, caught between hope and fear, waiting to see whether Ibrahim Traoré would crumble or rise. Crumble or rise. Hope that somehow Traoré would find the words to respond with dignity. Fear that another African leader would be made to look small before the world's cameras. Traorés's mind raced through possibilities. He could give them the response they expected. Defensive statistics about economic growth, explanations about security challenges, justifications for his actions that would sound like pleading. He could lose his temper, which would play perfectly into their narrative of the unstable African strongman. Or he could remain silent, which they would interpret as an admission of illegitimacy. But there was another option, one that required more courage than facing bullets or confronting corrupt ministers. He could tell the truth, not the sanitized, diplomatic truth that international forums preferred, but the raw, uncomfortable truth about power. About exploitation, about the hypocrisy that governed international relations. The seconds ticked by like hours. Social media exploded with commentary. #Traoré response was trending globally as people watched this young African leader sit in silence while being systematically humiliated by someone who had never faced the challenges he dealt with daily. In the audience, a young journalist from Ghana found herself holding her breath. She had covered similar confrontations before, had seen African leaders stumble over these exact types of questions, and had written articles analyzing their failures to effectively communicate on the global stage. But something felt different this time. The quality of Traorés's silence was not that of someone scrambling for words. It was the silence of someone choosing his moment. The moderator's confidence grew with each passing second. She had been in journalism for 30 years, had interviewed presidents and prime ministers, had made careers and broken political aspirations with carefully crafted questions. This young soldier from Burkina Faso, despite his growing reputation, was still just another African leader who would eventually bow to Western pressure. "Captain Traoré," she said again, this time with a slight edge of impatience, "the international community is waiting for your answer. How do you respond to charges that your government lacks legitimacy?" Behind those words lay decades of assumption. The assumption that legitimacy could only be granted by Western approval. That democracy was a gift to be bestowed by former colonial powers. That African leaders needed to justify their existence to European journalists and American diplomats. Traoré's hands remained steady on the table. His breathing was calm, controlled. Those who had served with him in the military recognized the signs. This was how he looked just before making the decision that would change everything on a battlefield. The same calm, the same focused intensity, the same moment of absolute clarity before action. The camera operators adjusted their positions, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The room's energy shifted subtly as people realized that this silence was not weakness but preparation. Even the most cynical observers began to lean forward, uncertain now about how this would unfold. The moderator opened her mouth to press again to drive home her advantage while she still held it. But at that exact moment, Ibrahim Traoré's eyes lifted to meet hers directly, and something in his gaze made her pause. There was no anger there, no defensiveness, no submission. Instead, there was something far more dangerous to her narrative. Complete, unshakable confidence. And then, in front of everyone, he made a choice that shocked the entire crowd. Ibrahim Traoré leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone, calm and measured, like a teacher addressing students who had missed an important lesson. "Madame," he began, using the French honorific with perfect pronunciation, "I appreciate your question about legitimacy. It gives me an opportunity to address something that I think this room needs to hear." The change in energy was immediate. This wasn't the defensive scrambling they had expected. His tone was respectful but not deferential, confident but not arrogant. Every word was chosen with surgical precision. "You ask about my legitimacy as a leader," he continued, his eyes sweeping across the room to include not just the moderator, but the entire audience. "Let me ask you something in return. When your government signed contracts allowing foreign companies to extract billions of dollars in gold from Burkina Faso while leaving our people without clean water, was that legitimate?" The room went deadly quiet. This was not the script anyone had prepared for. Western diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mining executives suddenly found their phones very interesting. When your international community watched corruption drain our national treasury for decades and said nothing because those corrupt leaders bought your weapons and honored your mining contracts, was that legitimate? His voice remained steady, conversational even. But each question landed like a precision strike. The moderator's confident smile began to fade as she realized she had walked into something far more complex than she had anticipated. When children in my country died from preventable diseases, while European companies extracted uranium from our soil to power their nuclear plants, was that legitimate? The audience was transfixed. African delegates who had been looking at their papers now sat up straight, some with barely contained smiles. This was what they had all wanted to say in similar situations, but had never found the words or the courage. "You see," Madame Traoré continued, "I think we need to be very careful about how we define legitimacy, because if legitimacy means having the approval of the same international community that has systematically exploited Africa for centuries, then yes, you are correct. I lack that legitimacy and I am proud of it." The moderator tried to interrupt. "Captain, that's not Mr. President," Traoré corrected gently but firmly. "I am the president of Burkina Faso, elected by the circumstances of my people's desperation when your legitimate leaders failed them completely." The correction wasn't angry or defensive. It was simply factual, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he represented. "You want to know about my mandate?" he continued. "My mandate comes from the mothers who can now afford to feed their children because we renegotiated mining contracts fairly. My mandate comes from students who can attend universities we're building with our own resources instead of foreign debt. My mandate comes from farmers who are no longer forced to grow cash crops for European markets while their own families go hungry." Camera operators found themselves zooming in on the Kaiwan and the faces around the room. The expressions told the whole story. Discomfort from Western delegates, growing excitement from African representatives, and complete fascination from journalists who were witnessing something unprecedented. But let me address your real question, Traoré said, his voice taking on a slightly different tone, warmer but more pointed. The question you're really asking is not about legitimacy. It's about compliance. You want to know if I will be a good African leader, meaning one who smiles, says the right things at forums like this, and continues to allow the systematic exploitation of his people as long as it's done through proper diplomatic channels. The silence in the room was now absolute. Even the moderator seemed frozen, uncertain how to regain control of an interview that had completely reversed its power dynamic. And the answer to that question, is no. The word hung in the air with finality. I will not be legitimate by those standards. I will not be the kind of African leader who apologizes for putting his people first. An African delegate in the third row began to clap slowly, then stopped himself, remembering where he was. But the gesture didn't go unnoticed. You ask how I justify my position, Traoré concluded, his eyes meeting the moderator's directly. I justify it the same way any leader should, by the results I deliver for the people I serve. Since taking office, we have reduced child mortality, increased literacy, renegotiated exploitative contracts, and restored dignity to a nation that was treated like a colonial outpost well into the 21st century. He paused, letting the words sink in. So when you ask about my legitimacy, I want you to ask yourself this. What legitimacy do you have to question the sovereignty of a nation you've never lived in, whose struggles you've never faced, whose resources you've helped extract for decades without fair compensation? The room erupted, not in chaos but in a kind of stunned recognition. Some delegates began applauding quietly at first, then more boldly. Others sat in shocked silence. The moderator looked like she had been struck by lightning. But what happened afterward would change everything. The applause started small. A few African delegates who couldn't contain themselves any longer. But it grew, spreading through the room like wildfire. Delegates from across the global south joined in. Then some from Asia, even a few from Latin America. What had begun as an attempt to humiliate had transformed into a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. The moderator sat speechless, her carefully prepared follow-up questions suddenly meaningless. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. African leaders were supposed to be defensive, apologetic, eager to prove their worthiness to the international community. They weren't supposed to turn the tables with such devastating clarity. But Ibrahim Traoré wasn't finished. As the applause died down, he continued speaking, his voice now carrying the weight of not just his own authority, but the hopes of an entire continent that had been waiting generations for someone to speak these truths on such a stage. I want to be very clear about something he said, his tone shifting to one of absolute sincerity. I did not come here to attack anyone or any nation. I came here hoping for genuine partnership, for relationships based on mutual respect rather than the colonial attitudes that still poison international relations. The room hung on every word. Social media had exploded globally. #Traoré Geneva was trending in over 50 countries. News networks around the world were cutting to live coverage of what many were calling the most significant diplomatic moment in years. But partnership requires honesty, he continued. It requires acknowledging the truth about how we got to where we are today. It requires admitting that the poverty in Africa is not some natural disaster or cultural failing. It is the direct result of centuries of systematic extraction and exploitation. In the audience, a young student from the University of Ghana, who was attending as part of a youth delegation, found tears streaming down her face. This was what she and her classmates had dreamed of hearing. Sessentine, an African leader speaking truth to power with such dignity and strength that even his critics were forced to listen. When I took power in Burkina Faso, Traoré said, I found a nation that was rich in resources but poor in hope. Gold mines operated by foreign companies that paid almost nothing in taxes. Uranium deposits that powered European cities while our own people lived without electricity. Agricultural policies designed by international organizations that forced us to grow crops for export while importing food for our own children. The Western delegates who had been so comfortable at the beginning of this session now looked like they were sitting on hot coals. Some checked their phones nervously. Others whispered urgently to their aides. The narrative they had come to reinforce of legitimate international institutions guiding wayward African nations was crumbling in real time. So yes, Traoré said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. I'd change those arrangements. I renegotiated contracts so that our resources benefit our people. I prioritized our food security over your export quotas. I chose the dignity of my people over the approval of institutions that have never had their best interests at heart. The applause this time was thunderous, not just from African delegates, but from representatives of nations across the developing world who had faced similar pressures, similar attempts to make them choose between their people's welfare and international approval. The moderator finally found her voice. "Mr. President," she said, the title coming reluctantly, "surely you must acknowledge that international cooperation requires honesty." Traoré cut her off gently but firmly. "It requires treating sovereign nations as equals rather than children to be guided. It requires admitting that some of the institutions we're told to respect were designed to maintain the same power structures that have kept Africa poor while making others rich." The camera captured the exact moment when the entire dynamic of international discourse shifted. This wasn't just one African leader speaking anymore. This was the voice of a new generation of leadership that refused to accept the old rules of the game. In the hours that followed, the footage went viral worldwide. News analysts called it a watershed moment. African universities organized viewing parties. Students in Ouagadougou danced in the streets. For the first time in generations, they had seen their continent represented with dignity and strength on the world stage. The response from traditional Western media was telling. Some outlets focused on Traorés' controversial statements and his confrontational approach, but they couldn't ignore the substance of what he had said or the fact that he had said it with such compelling clarity. More importantly, the response from Africa and the Global South was electric. Leaders who had been quietly implementing similar policies suddenly found their voices. The language of international relations began to shift with terms like mutual respect and genuine partnership, replacing the old colonial vocabularies of guidance and supervision. 3 months later, at the African Union Summit, Traoré was elected to chair the Economic Cooperation Committee. 6 months later, Burkina Faso's GDP growth rate was the highest in West Africa. A year later, 3 more African nations had renegotiated their mining contracts using Burkina Faso's model. But perhaps most importantly, a generation of young Africans had seen what was possible when their leaders spoke with courage and dignity. They had witnessed the transformation of what was meant to be a moment of humiliation into a declaration of independence from mental colonialism. And that is why this story of Ibrahim Traoré will never be forgotten. If you were moved by this story of courage and dignity in the face of attempted humiliation, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories of African leadership. Share this video so others can witness the power of speaking truth with dignity and strength. This is what real leadership looks like. Not perfect, not without controversy, but honest, courageous, and completely committed to the dignity and welfare of the people it serves. Thank you for watching. And remember, the world changes when we have the courage to speak our truth with dignity, even when the whole world is watching. Even when the whole world is watching.